It's June 1944, somewhere in rural France. German reconnaissance spots an entire American armored division rolling into position, hundreds of tanks, dozens of artillery pieces, trucks, and thousands of soldiers preparing for a massive offensive. The Germans scramble to reposition their forces, calling in reserves, redirecting precious resources to counter this overwhelming threat. But here's the thing, none of it was real. Those tanks, inflatable rubber, the artillery, painted canvas and wood, the sounds of engines and construction, played from speakers hidden in the trees. And most of those soldiers, they weren't combat troops at all. They were artists, designers, and sound engineers pulling off the greatest magic trick in military history. This is the story of the Ghost Army, the top-secret American deception unit that fooled Hitler's forces again and again, saving countless lives and changing the course of World War II with nothing but creativity, courage, and some very clever props. Welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving into one of World War II's most fascinating and least-known stories, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, better known as the Ghost Army. For decades, their missions were classified, their achievements unknown. These weren't your typical soldiers. They were recruited from art schools, advertising agencies, and radio stations. Their weapons weren't guns. They were inflatable decoys, sound effects, and psychological warfare. Over the course of 20 missions across Europe, this 1,000-man unit created illusions so convincing that they regularly made the Germans believe they were facing forces 10 to 30 times larger than they actually were. And in doing so, they helped win the war. So how did they do it? What kind of person becomes a professional military deceiver? And why did it take 50 years for their story to finally come to light? Let's find out. The Ghost Army was born out of desperation and innovation. By 1943, the Allies knew they'd eventually invade Nazi-occupied Europe. But they faced a serious problem. The Germans had powerful defensive positions, and any invasion would cost tremendous lives. The element of surprise would be crucial, but how do you hide the movement of hundreds of thousands of troops? Enter a British architect named Basil Spence and American planners who'd been studying British deception tactics in North Africa. The British had already experimented with dummy tanks and fake installations to mislead German reconnaissance. The idea was simple but radical. If you can make the enemy think you're somewhere you're not, or that you're stronger than you are, you can manipulate their entire strategy without firing a shot. The U.S. Army established the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops in January 1944 and began recruiting in the most unusual way imaginable. They didn't want infantry veterans or tank commanders. They wanted people who could think creatively, who understood illusion and perception. So they raided art schools, particularly the Philadelphia Museum School of Art, and advertising agencies across New York and Chicago. The roster reads like a who's who of the American art world. Fashion designer Bill Blass was there. So was photographer Art Kane, painter Ellsworth Kelly, and sculptor Harold Lehner. These weren't men trained in combat. They were trained in making people see what wasn't really there. And that made them perfect for the job. The unit was organized into 4 main components. The 603rd Camouflage Engineers handled the visual deception, the fake tanks and equipment. The 3,132nd Signal Service Company Special created sonic deceptions with recorded sounds. The Signal Company Special provided radio deception by simulating the communications of entire divisions. And the 406th Combat Engineers provided security and some construction support. Everything about the operation was classified at the highest levels. These soldiers couldn't tell their families what they were doing. Many of them didn't fully understand the scope of their mission until they were already in Europe, inflating their first rubber tank in a muddy French field while German planes flew overhead. So how exactly do you fake an army? The answer lies in understanding what your enemy can see and hear, and then giving them exactly what they expect, but completely fabricated. Let's start with the visual deception. The Ghost Army's inflatable tanks were engineering marvels for their time. Made from rubber and canvas, a single Sherman tank decoy weighed only about 85 pounds and could be inflated by 4 men in about 5 minutes using air compressors. Once inflated, from the air or at a distance, they looked remarkably convincing. The unit had complete arsenals of these decoys: tanks, trucks, artillery pieces, and even planes. But here's the genius part. They didn't just inflate them and walk away. The artists in the unit understood that believability comes from detail. They added dirt and mud to make them look used. They created fake track marks in the ground leading to and from the decoys. They hung laundry nearby to suggest troops. They even had soldiers drive jeeps around the dummy installations to create dust and activity. One soldier would later recall how they'd position fake tanks at the edge of tree lines, partially concealed, as if commanders were trying to hide them, knowing that German reconnaissance would spot them anyway. It's a psychological trick. Something partially hidden often seems more real than something in plain sight, because it suggests someone is trying to keep it secret. The sonic deception was equally sophisticated. The 3,132nd Signal Service Company had recorded the sounds of actual military operations: tanks moving, trucks idling, construction equipment working, soldiers shouting orders. These weren't simple recordings either. They'd been professionally produced with multiple layers of sound that could be mixed and played through powerful speakers mounted on half-tracks. They could create the audio signature of an entire armored division preparing for battle. Imagine you're a German soldier in a quiet sector, and suddenly, in the middle of the night, you hear the unmistakable sounds of hundreds of tanks rolling into position a few miles away, the grinding of gears, the shouting of orders, the mechanical symphony of war preparation. You're going to report that up the chain immediately. The radio deception might have been the most subtle, but equally important. Every military unit has a distinct radio signature, certain frequencies they use, certain patterns of communication, certain code phrases. The signal company special would study the radio behavior of real divisions, then mimic it perfectly when the Ghost Army was impersonating that unit. German radio intelligence operators listening in would hear exactly what they expected to hear from a real American division. And finally, there was what they called special effects, the human element. Ghost Army soldiers would visit local bars and cafes in uniform, loudly discussing their unit and where they might be headed next, knowing that German spies or collaborators might overhear. They'd wear the shoulder patches of the units they were impersonating. They'd drive around with appropriate vehicle markings. Every detail mattered. The Ghost Army's first major operation came shortly after D-Day, in Operation Elephant, designed to draw German attention away from the actual attack routes of Allied forces. They set up fake tank parks and supply dumps, creating the illusion of a massive force preparing to attack in one direction, while the real troops struck elsewhere. But perhaps their most crucial operation came in September 1944, near the town of Brest in France. The American forces were preparing to cross the Rhine River, a massive and dangerous operation. The Ghost Army was tasked with making the Germans believe that the 2nd Armored Division and the 81st Infantry Division were still positioned south of the river, when in fact those units had been moved north for the actual crossing. For 3 days, the 1,000 men of the Ghost Army impersonated 30,000. They set up inflatable tanks by the hundreds. They played recordings of armor movements at night. They transmitted radio messages mimicking 2 entire divisions. German forces, completely fooled, kept significant forces positioned against the ghost divisions, forces that could have been defending against the real crossing. The operation was a complete success. The real divisions crossed with lighter resistance than anticipated, and German commanders didn't realize they'd been deceived until it was too late. One of the most dangerous missions came during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. This was Hitler's last major offensive, and it caught Allied forces off guard. As American troops scrambled to respond, the Ghost Army was rushed to the front near Luxembourg. Their mission: make the Germans believe that significant reinforcements had arrived, buying time for real units to get into position. This was different from their previous operations. They weren't miles behind the lines. They were in active combat zones. German patrols were everywhere. Artillery fire was constant. And yet, they had to maintain their deception. They inflated their dummy tanks under cover of darkness. They played their sound effects recordings. They kept up their radio transmissions. All while German scouts were close enough to potentially discover the ruse. Several Ghost Army soldiers later admitted this was the most terrifying operation of their service. If the Germans had discovered that these weren't real combat units, they were positioned to be quickly overrun. But the deception held. German intelligence reported significant American reinforcements in the sector, and their offensive momentum slowed in that area while they reassessed their strategy. Throughout the war, the Ghost Army conducted over 20 missions, often operating just miles from German lines. They're credited with saving an estimated 10,000 to 30,000 American lives by diverting enemy forces and attention away from real operations. But what made them truly remarkable wasn't just their technical skill, it was their bravery. These were artists and designers who'd been thrust into war zones armed with inflatable rubber instead of rifles, and told to fool one of the most sophisticated military machines in history. And they did it, again and again. One veteran later described the surreal nature of their work, setting up fake equipment while under potential observation, knowing that if the enemy figured out the trick, you might not make it out. Another recalled the strange pride they took in their deceptions. Every time they learned that German forces had responded to their fake installations, it meant their art was working, and real soldiers somewhere else were safer because of it. What's fascinating about the Ghost Army is that these soldiers never stopped being artists, even in the middle of war. During downtime between operations, they sketched and painted what they saw. They documented the war not just through military reports, but through art. Ellsworth Kelly, who would become one of America's most celebrated abstract painters, created hundreds of sketches and paintings during his service. His work from this period shows everything from the French countryside to his fellow soldiers to the equipment they worked with. The experience of reducing military equipment to essential shapes and forms in his deception work likely influenced his later minimalist style. Bill Blass, who would go on to become a legendary fashion designer, was just another private in the Ghost Army, but he later said the experience taught him about the power of illusion and presentation, skills that served him well on the runway. What these men learned was that perception is reality in warfare. If the enemy believes something is true, they'll act on that belief. And the Ghost Army became masters of controlling perception. They weren't just following orders, they were thinking strategically about how to make their illusions more convincing, more believable. They were problem solvers and innovators, bringing artistic creativity to military deception. The camaraderie among these men was unique. They weren't typical soldiers, and they knew it. They bonded over their shared outsider status in the military, their creative backgrounds, and the bizarre nature of their mission. Years later, survivors would recall the strange mix of terror and absurdity. Inflating a rubber tank while artillery thundered in the distance, painting fake division markings on jeeps while German planes flew reconnaissance overhead. After the war ended in 1945, the Ghost Army was quietly disbanded. The soldiers went home, but they couldn't talk about what they'd done. The entire operation remained classified. These men who'd pulled off some of the most successful deceptions in military history couldn't share their stories, couldn't take credit for their achievements. They simply returned to their lives and careers, carrying secret histories. It would take until 1996, more than 50 years after the war ended, for the Ghost Army's story to be declassified. By then, many of the veterans had passed away. Those who remained finally got to tell their stories, and the world learned about this remarkable unit. Today, their legacy lives on in multiple ways. Modern military deception units still use many of the principles the Ghost Army pioneered. The combination of visual, audio, and electronic deception, the attention to detail that makes illusions believable. The unit proved that creativity and intelligence can be as powerful as firepower. Their story has been documented in books, a PBS documentary, and exhibitions of the art they created during their service. In 2024, Congress finally awarded the Ghost Army the Congressional Gold Medal, one of the highest civilian honors, recognizing their extraordinary contribution to the war effort. The Ghost Army represents something profound about human ingenuity in the face of adversity. When conventional weapons weren't enough, when the cost in lives would have been too high, creativity became the weapon. Artists became soldiers, and illusion became strategy. These 1,000 men, armed with nothing but rubber, canvas, speakers, and their imagination, convinced the Nazi war machine again and again that they faced overwhelming force. They saved thousands of lives. They helped win a war. And they did it by making the impossible seem real. The next time you hear about smoke and mirrors, remember that sometimes that's exactly what wins battles, as long as you have artists brave enough and creative enough to make the smoke look real and position the mirrors just right. That's the incredible story of the Ghost Army, one of World War II's most fascinating and least known units. What do you think about their tactics? Could something like this work in modern warfare with all our satellites and technology? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this deep dive into hidden history, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more stories like this. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.